What's up, guys? So today we're learning about Chapter 8 in our textbook, Grammar to Enrich and Enhance Writing. Chapter 8 talks about editing, and there's a process in editing that we can use to give to our students so that their writing becomes better. And so to begin with, editing really to start off, it begins with observation. The teacher needs to observe a collection of writings throughout a different period. So mainly maybe the first quarter of teaching semester. So they're going to collect that data, start to observe it, but we got to come to a stop and check ourselves, because oftentimes grammar books, different instructional methods in writing, they teach the traditional error hunt when it comes to editing. And what that means is we're picking out errors only rather than creating beauty in writing. So on a student's perspective, if I turn in a paper, I want some good feedback so that I can write maybe a second draft, maybe a third draft. But if I receive that paper back and there's a ton of red ink on it, it's gonna scare me at first, mainly first because of the color red, inflicts kind of like fear and all that. But you get all those scribbles on your paper, and you're looking at it, you're like, man, I really messed up. And what that does to students over time, it really didn't do that. It really didn't do it for me, but students start to see themselves as a failure when they get their feedback nowadays, right? So what the text says is that students tend to become afraid, right? They become afraid to write, and this is maybe why a lot of students don't like to write, or they're just hesitant to write, because they feel as if they're a failure if they make mistakes, right? Writing should be a craft, it should be an art, beauty, and the textbook dives into this, that it's dangerous to be just scribbling red ink all over. There is a place for that, but editing instruction is more than just correcting, right? It's about teaching students the patterns and concepts rather than the rules, mechanics, and grammar. And if you're a well-rounded teacher, you're going to be able to balance all these things. But the textbook, and as we have learned throughout the previous chapters, is that a lot of times we get lost in that mix. So it's I like the title, Facing the Error of Our Ways, because it's our natural tendency to pick up like a red or blue pen and just scratch out things and correct them. But we're really correcting them from our own perspective, our own observations. How can we change that? How can we turn that around to give the students some voice in their writing? And that's what we're looking for. And that's what this chapter kind of aims to teach. And we teach it through the a WUBIS model. That's one of the techniques that we can use, and that's on this next slide after this one. But when we can use editing combined with the writing process, it's going to create wonderful writing, and it's proven to work. So what the text says is that editing is a visual skill, right? Kayla and I took an editing essentials course. It was an online course. It was kind of miserable because it was online editing, right? Nobody wants to really do that. But what we had to do is we had to know how to edit. We had a textbook to supplement us, but it was mainly a visual skill. The professor asked us to go in, edit the paper, and correct it. But we were just simply correcting it. We weren't improving the work really in any way in terms of content. We're just fixing the mistakes. So I think that's what a lot of teachers struggle with. And the text states that students need examples from their writing, their teacher's writing, and literature. And there's 3 components to that. So student writing, that means maybe gathering a few examples. Obviously, you want to keep it confidential as to not offend any student. You want to get consent before you put any work on the board. So, for example, I put a student's sentence on the board, and maybe it has a few errors. So as a group, we can look at it, figure out the errors, and then maybe add in or delete a few words to make the sentence better. And we use certain models such as the WUBIS model. You got your fanboys, different conjunctions, complex sentences, all of those language lessons that we've been learning about. You can teach those to students, and you're working like editing within the writing process, because like the overall goal is improving writing. Teachers writing, obviously as a teacher you can put up your own examples, and literature is one of my favorites. If you can supplement literature in any way in the classroom, you're only going to find positive benefits. So that would look like maybe just putting up an example from like a professional author, one of their favorite books maybe, and just highlighting how the authors are using their writing in their in their own ways, because each student should have a voice. And I feel like we are eliminating student voice when we're always editing over their papers. And I put over here a red pen because it's like the classic stereotype, classic like English teacher sitting in their reclining chair about 5 p.m. Editing a ton of papers. And what does that gain us? What does that like gain for the class as a whole? How can we transfer this into the students' hands? Well, it's a process, right? The title of this is, working editing into the writing process. And it's 2 layers that we look at, and it's beauty and effect. Beauty being writing as a craft, it's an art form, students should have a voice. And then the effect, right? They start to learn how the writing process and editing work together to create better writing. And then these 2 things should work simultaneously. And I mentioned this right here, writing needs to be a creational facility rather than a correctional one. And I like the analogy of going to jail, right? When you go to jail, it's a correctional facility. You are going there to be corrected, and you're spit out into hopefully a better person. And I think teachers like to correct, right? Because they want to make the papers better, but it's only under their own lens, unless you provide peer editing days. But do students really know how to edit well? So it's a difficult task, and I think we need to shift it towards creational. Let students have voice in the classroom. Let them figure out what good writing actually is. And I put an example up here so we can kind of take a step back and kind of dive into this. So Cheyenne is a 5th grader, and this is an example from the textbook of an incorrect sentence. So when we see an incorrect sentence, what do we do, right? So the teacher in this chapter, in this example, is using this sentence because she really understands the Awubis model, and I have a worksheet that we'll look at later, but the Awubis model is on the next slide. And so Cheyenne writes, when my sister turned 5, period, we took her to the teddy bear factory, period. After she finally picked out her clothes, period, we went to eat at the Cheesecake Factory. So at first glance, this seems like a pretty good sentence. She has some clauses. She has, a lot of different, it kind of flows really well. But the only problem here is that there are sentence fragments all over the place. When my sister turned 5, period, right? We can change that period, obviously we know, into a comma. So she's using good language here, but the goal would be, after applying the Awubis model that we'll look at, is we'll change it into a much better sentence. And this is just an example how we can take student writing and create it into a much better one. And we can obviously change this to a much better sentence. The textbook doesn't give us any, it doesn't improve it at all, but we can use our own imaginations. And that kind of transitions into what I've been talking about, is the Awubis model. And so Awubis is acronym. Each letter means, one clause, and so it stands for many common subordinated conjunctions. And a subordinated conjunction is defined as a word or phrase that links a dependent clause to an independent clause. So these, and you can follow it: A, W, U, B, I, S. So that translates to after, as, although, when, while, until, because, before, if, and since. And So I like using these a lot in my writing because I've been taught how to use them. And when you use them, so if we go back to here, when my sister turned 5, what would she do? She uses when, but it needs something to complete the sentence because it's not a complete sentence, right? Sentence fragment. So to fix this as a class, we could be like, when my sister turned 5, comma, we took her to the teddy bear factory. And we talk about overusing subordinating clauses, and that's how we know when students really know what it is. Like if we teach commas one day, students are gonna put a bunch of commas. It's just habit. So after she, so little spelling, maybe wordiness there. After we went there, she finally picked out her clothes. So that's how we can incorporate these subordinating clauses. And like I said, I got a worksheet at the end that we can look at. But the text says to make these processes stick, we must find examples from literature because it proves credibility. It creates credibility if we're using professional authors to drive the point home. And when we use examples from literature, we really remind them this is how you create beautiful writing. And so that's the process, the AWUBIS process acronym. I like it. And it's pretty fun, and you can introduce it in a fun way. You can kind of toy around with students, well, do you know what AWUBIS is? And that's how you can kind of get them hooked on it, and they'll really want to know what it's about. And that's what the teacher does at the beginning of the chapter. But as we're moving on, like I said, it's a short chapter, but making editing a positive experience. So there's 5 points here. Making editing more of a creational facility rather than a correctional one. We've already explained that. 2, spend more time highlighting what is right and what is beautiful rather than hunting for errors. So that is really big. That's probably one of the biggest points in this chapter. We want to spend our quality time highlighting what is beautiful in the story that they write, whether it be, a story or a narrative, argumentative, essay, whatever it may be. Because when we're just hunting for errors, we're only looking for the negative. We got to bring out the positives in students' writing. Number 3, make grammar about meaning. So grammar can't just be on its own. It must mean something. And what that means for us as teachers is we have to connect grammar to the writing process, as we've learned through this course. But grammar is highly connected to meaning. When we can really drive it home to students, they're really going to enjoy it, and they're going to use it a lot more in their writing. Number 4, we've kind of talked about constantly write and collect examples and refer to literature. So that's student writing, teacher writing, and literature. If we can use those 3 points, blend them in, students will start to appreciate the beauty and effect of their work. So yeah, and this basically we're driving home everything. I say that a lot, but we're teaching concepts and patterns about writing on a deeper level. And that's why I kind of like this chapter. I like the AWUBIS model. And there's so many more models that we can use. Fanboy is one of those. Those are the conjunctions that we use a lot, oftentimes. And we really just want to make editing a positive experience for students, because we want to start to allow them to edit their own papers. We want to start to allow them to figure out their mistakes on their own, so they catch it and then they create better writing as a result. So it's a short chapter, like I said. It's only about 10 pages. There's not a lot of content to work with, but I have an activity, and I'm recording this right now, but you guys will have a worksheet at your desk. We can kind of look at this. I'm gonna go through it, but I kind of I found it on the internet and I added my own twist to it. So I titled it main and subordinate clauses worksheet. So it defines it. A clause is a part of a sentence. A clause must contain a verb. The main clause makes sense on its own. The subordinating clause gives further meaning to the main clause. So that defines it even more. We have some directions for the worksheet. Underline the main clause once and the subordinating clause twice in each sentence below. So students are kind of diving into these examples so that they can get it pounded in their brain. Got 10 examples, and you can do a lot of different worksheets. I went online, I seen a bunch of different worksheets that students can, obviously you can print off and have them do just for that habitual practice. So I'm just gonna read off a few examples here. Number 1, when my father arrives, he will give the directions. So what we would look at is the main clause. I think he will give the directions. In the subordinating clause, we would underline twice, when my father arrives. So he will give the directions can stand on its own, but if we can highlight the sentence even more, we're giving it like a timestamp. So when my father arrives, he will give the directions. Number 2, when my mother shows, she will bring the food. So we can look at that and we can use the AWOBIS model, right? When my mother shows, she will bring the food. So students will have this acronym like just drilled into their brain as they're going through. Like if you create a unit out of this little unit segment, they're gonna know what an AWOBIS is and how they can apply it. When my mother shows, she will bring the food. So kind of like when my mother shows up, she will bring food over. If we go down to maybe number 6, before the food gets cold, go sit at the table. So go sit at the table can sit alone by itself on paper. If you just say before the food gets cold and you leave it at that, just as we saw in Cheyenne's writing, when my sister turned 5. Well, what happened when she turned 5? Readers need to like piece it together. You can't just leave it on its own. So if we look at this, before the food gets cold, what do we have to do? Go sit at the table and eat, right? So it makes sense, but sometimes students, this is a 5th grader, right? And that's pretty good writing for a 5th grader. And that's where I like teaching it early. Phone just fell. Teach this stuff as early as you can, right? You want developmentally appropriate education, but if we can teach these things early with purpose, it's going to create a lot of beautiful writing. So that's really all I have for you guys. I wish I could have taken a little bit longer. I prepared a PowerPoint short chapter, but the main things here, I'd like to go back to the red pen syndrome, right? Teachers often just take the red pens out and they just draw all over the pages, and imagine doing that for 30 student papers. Let's say you have a narrative assignment, maybe 3-4 pages, right? You're doing that for 30 students times however many classes. Let's say you have 7 English classes. You don't want to have to do all that. I think it's a lot of wasted time. Yes, there's a time and a place for editing, but if we can start to transition editing into the students' hands, we may do a lot better when it comes to like state tests where students have to actually go out on their own at a desk and write. So if they can use these skills through like the AWOBIS model, I'm sure there's many other models out there, many other acronyms that they can use to further enhance their writing, as we've learned through chapters 1 through 7 and then 9 and beyond. There's so many different strategies that we can use to help these students. And so red pen syndrome, we drive that home to our teachers. We can't do this. We can't error hunt because, like I've said, students become afraid, and that's no bueno. So that's really all I have for you guys. And obviously I brought everything out straight from the textbook that we have. And so I've never taught like this before. It seems like awkward because I'm just talking to the phone, but it's interesting, and I would have it displayed on the board, but I couldn't figure out how to. So it'll be interesting sitting in class and listening to this over again but it's good. I'm excited. So appreciate you guys. I'll have this worksheet for you to look at, and we'll kind of like walk through what the Wobus model is, and you'll be able to see my presentation. So appreciate you guys.